Hello, my name is Jacqueline Pollauf, and today I want to talk about descending arpeggios on the harp. I think this is really an important technique, and it comes up in all kinds of repertoire. Probably one of the most famous examples is from the Nutcracker. Here is the opening of the Waltz of the Flowers cadenza. I'm going to approach this from a repertoire standpoint today. So what I'll do is I'm going to use a series of pieces and sort of show the rapid evolution of the descending arpeggio. So I'll start with a beginning level piece with just a couple of fingers, and then from there I'll jump to a late beginning piece and then to an intermediate piece and so forth. So this way you can see sort of where you would start out, then how you would move forward, and where the eventual end goal is for descending arpeggios. As a teacher, I would never do this, all at once, but I kind of spread it out. So if someone is playing at a beginning level, there's a lot of different harp techniques that I'm covering, but I'm sure to check in on descending arpeggios. And then as the student increases in their technical ability and is playing harder music, again, I'm sure to throw in a couple of pieces to cover descending arpeggios again. So as we're doing all of this, I'll also talk about a few practice approaches that you might use in building up your skills. And I would say if you're a beginning student, you might only be able to play the first couple of pieces that I'm going to present, but it's sometimes nice to see where you're headed, what you're doing all of this work and what you're building towards. And maybe if you've been playing for a while, but you're struggling with descending arpeggios, it might be nice to see how you could sort of go back and shore up your technique. And if you're a teacher, it might be nice just to get some more repertoire ideas to use in working with descending arpeggios. I'm going to start with a piece called Little Prelude, written by Susann McDonald. This comes from her graded recital series that she has with fellow composer Linda Wood. And this particular piece is from Harp Solos Volume 1. What I really like about this piece is that it just uses two fingers in each hand. The third finger is not added in. And throughout the piece, the first section is entirely descending arpeggios, and they keep changing shape or interval. So it starts out with a third in the right hand, and then it's just a second in the left hand, and as you go, she adds in a fourth, and she adds in a fifth, and all kinds of different shapes. And a huge part of being good at descending arpeggios is being able to easily see these shapes when you're reading the music and then have your fingers go right to them on the strings. So I'm just going to play the first couple lines as kind of to give you a little bit of a taste of the piece. And from there, it keeps going. There's a contrasting section that is ascending arpeggios, which is quite similar, just changing direction. And then it comes back around to the A section again with the descending arpeggios. I think if you're learning the piece, of course, I would go a lot slower than I just played it. A couple of things you could think about. If you're having trouble finding the shapes, a great way to practice any passage of descending arpeggios is to just play in chords. So playing both notes right together. So you're forcing your fingers to land on the strings at the exact same time. That's important. And then another thing you could think about is listening for an even sound so that both of your finger and your thumb match in sound. You don't have one sticking out more than the other, but that you get a nice sort of even sound all the way across. So that was Little Prelude by Susann McDonald. Next is White Gull's Flight, written by Betty Paret. This comes from her second harp book, and I believe that at the time she was writing this, the lever harp as an instrument for students was not yet standard, so pretty much everyone studying classical harp played a pedal harp right off. And consequently, she wrote this for the pedal harp, but for the most part, it works really well on the lever harp as well. The only issue is that she uses the low A string once, and most lever harps don't go that low, but you can easily just take it up an octave and have mainly the same effect for the piece. It's written in the key of A minor with an added G sharp and D sharp, so you can preset either your levers or your pedals for this piece. And it uses 3-note arpeggios in both hands. The hands always match, which is nice. And for the most part, the shape is really straightforward. It's just a root position triad. I'll go ahead and play the first part. There are a couple measures where she uses the root position triad and then moves it through inversions, so the shapes change in those measures. But I think this is a great piece for very standard shapes throughout, and it's an excellent choice for someone at sort of a late beginning or early intermediate level. I wanted next to look at a piece called Rouet, written by Alphonse Hasselmans, and this comes from his Trois Petites Pièces Faciles. It's quite similar actually to the White Gull's Flight. It also is filled with just 3-note arpeggios, so 3 fingers in each hand. And it's also in the key of A minor, so it sounds kind of shockingly similar at the beginning to the White Gull's Flight. But of course there are a couple of key differences. One is that it's only playable on the pedal harp due to the pedal changes throughout it. And the other is that the chord shapes change far more frequently, and there's a greater variety of shapes. So here's the first section. That's about half of the first full section, and then there's a contrasting B section, which is ascending arpeggios, and then it comes back around to the A section with the descending arpeggios again. I think if you're working on this and you're having trouble finding all of the different shapes, a great way to practice this, or any piece with the descending arpeggios, is to play in chords, like I was doing a little bit of with the little prelude. So you could just play 3-note chords in each hand, focusing on trying to feel your shape before you get to the strings, and have all 3 fingers land simultaneously without having to rearrange. I'd say this piece is written kind of at maybe an early intermediate level, and as I mentioned before, it's playable only on the pedal harp. The Little Fountain by Samuel Pratt is a classic piece for descending arpeggios. And it's written for the lever harp at kind of an intermediate level, I would say. It's a fairly long piece. It starts out like this. So those are all 4-note arpeggios, so 4 fingers in each hand. It does that for a while, then there's a section of 3-note arpeggios. Then it goes back to the 4-note arpeggios. Then there's sort of a slower section in the middle. And then it goes back around to the beginning with the 4-note arpeggios. I think for many people, adding another finger, the 4th finger for their arpeggios, is more of a step up than they think it will be. It seems like it shouldn't be that bad because it's just 1 more finger, but there are many more options for different shapes of arpeggios. Frequently the 4th finger also is a little bit harder to control. It's not a very independent finger by design. So sometimes people end up with arpeggios that are a little bit messy. They're not very even. One great way to practice that, or again to practice any piece with descending arpeggios, is to purposefully change the rhythm. So it's written in this piece that all of the notes are even and equal in length, but you can play it instead, for practice purposes, in a long, short pattern. So long, short, 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 long, short. And then you could flip it around and do it in a short, long, short, long, short, long, short, long, short, long. And putting, changing the emphasis on each finger in that way, as you practice, really kind of builds your individual muscle control. So that's a really standard way to practice something like this. Another interesting thing about this piece is that for the most part, your right hand thumb is making a melody. So the way he has it notated, essentially it should be a bit louder than all of the other strings. I think in some of the earlier pieces we were talking about having an even sound, so not wanting anything to stick out. But having this thumb melody can be pretty common, and it's just the right hand thumb, the first note of each arpeggio, not the left hand thumb. So what you want is you want this one to be a bit louder, and the next 7 notes to all be softer and to match. And actually the way I just played it is a great way to practice that, again, to sort of change your rhythm. So have a long and louder note there, and then separate those out until that becomes more natural and you can put it back together. Sort of hearing that thumb sound soar across. So as I mentioned, this is a fairly long piece. Learning it definitely can take a little bit of time, but it's really a beautiful piece and a great chance to work on all of these skills. So that was The Little Fountain by Samuel Pratt. Earlier, I played a snippet from the Waltz of the Flowers cadenza by Tchaikovsky. And Tchaikovsky actually wrote 2 other harp cadenzas for different ballets, one for Sleeping Beauty and one for Swan Lake. And I think any of these 3 cadenzas are a great chance to work on descending arpeggios, because actually all 3 cadenzas are quite similar. I think Tchaikovsky knew what he liked in a harp cadenza, and so he was kind of sticking to it. But they all use 4-note arpeggios, so 4 notes, in each hand. For the most part, he just uses 7th chord and works through inversions. So the patterns are quite standard. Here's a little bit of the Sleeping Beauty cadenza. And of course, you could practice with any of the techniques that I've mentioned from doing 4-note chords. You could do the long, short rhythm. And then the short, long. You could also kind of vary it up and do 2 longs and 2 shorts. So long, long, short, short, long, long, short, short. Or switching that around and doing short, short, long, long. Another thing you could work on with any of these cadenzas is speed with these arpeggios. Because really, the classic way to play them is kind of to vary the speed a little bit. A lot of people like to get faster as they go down. And the only way to do that and have it come out well is to be really sure of your shapes so that your fingers are always easily finding their way back into the strings. And then I think a lot of practicing in rhythms so that you can control all the fingers and have a really even sound. Personally, I think the Sleeping Beauty cadenza is the easiest, but the Nutcracker is kind of a nice one to do because there are so many descending arpeggios in it, and also that one comes up a lot orchestrally. But any of the 3 work really well. Lastly, I wanted to look at La Source by Alphonse Hasselmans. Hasselmans also wrote Rouet, the piece that we looked at a few pieces ago, but this one, La Source, is probably his most famous composition. And it's an advanced level piece, playable only on the pedal harp. I think I forgot to mention it, but the Tchaikovsky excerpts that we were just looking at are also only playable on a pedal harp. And in La Source, there are 4-note arpeggios throughout pretty much the entire piece. I'm going to play a few bars of the main theme. There's quite a memorable melody. It can easily get stuck in your head. And it's a challenging piece for a number of reasons. One is that there are a lot of different chord shapes. Some are standard, some are not. There's a lot of jumping, especially in the right hand, between those different shapes. And then you also have to bring out a thumb melody at the same time, kind of similarly to Little Fountain, where that top note is always your melody. It needs to be a little bit louder than the rest. But it is certainly a beautiful piece and a well worth the effort, maybe something to work towards in your practice of descending arpeggios. And overall, I hope you found this video useful, this kind of excursion into all of these different pieces with descending arpeggios, and that it's given you some new ideas for your playing.